Hey y'all, what's up? Welcome back to Roots Refuge Farm. Today I am working on something. I figured we would have a conversation about container gardening. It may be a little early for a lot of people to be planting their containers, but it's definitely not too early to start thinking about it as you are planning your garden this year. The reason I wanted to go ahead and have this discussion today is because I got a message from our friends over at Greenstock that they are running a sale through tomorrow evening. Today is the 29th of January. Tomorrow's the 30th. It goes through the 30th on their leaf planters. And I'm going to show you a little bit about what I'm doing with one of my planters, but I wanted to tell you that if you have been waiting to purchase a Greenstock planter, if you are considering how do I garden this year with limited space, if you are wanting to learn to garden but you don't have a place that you can garden in the ground or in a raised bed, this is a great opportunity to get a tried and true product at a discount. So the planters are on sale. You can also stack my coupon code out. My coupon is Roots10. I'll put a link down below to the Greenstock site where you can check it out. The leaf planters are great for growing a bunch of salad greens. That's probably one of my favorite applications for them because the greens stay really clean, but also you can grow lots of different things in them. And today I want to talk a little bit about how to make that work a little more successfully. Check these babies out. Isn't it crazy how fast they grow? Oh, makes me so excited. These are not the ones that I'm here to grab though. I'm actually wanting this tray. These are sweet pea flowers, and my plan is to plant these out in one of my green stalks. My first garden that I actually successfully grew something, I failed real bad on an in-ground garden, but my first one that was successful was in containers. I grew some cherry tomatoes in pots, some beans, flowers, and that was my first real taste of like, okay, this actually works. Prior to my successful first garden in containers, I really miserably failed at growing in the ground, and I killed a lot of houseplants. I had a desire to garden, but I really didn't have any experience. And I am a big believer that like a few solid wins is really all you need to lock in gardening in your life. I think a lot of people try it, they fail because there is a learning curve, and then they give up because they assume that somehow it has something to do with them that they failed, when really it just always comes down to the conditions that our plants are being put in. And I love container gardening for the fact that it can really give people those wins before they're really in a position to garden on a larger scale. So why do people grow in containers? Lots of different reasons. One, a lot of times people are in a position that they're in a rental, or they are only in the place that they're living in temporarily. So they're not wanting to put a lot of work into establishing the soil in the ground or planting in the ground when they might have to leave those things. Sometimes they don't have permission. A lot of times it's a mobility issue. People grow in containers if they have some sort of physical limitation that makes containers an easier way for them to garden. It makes gardening accessible to a lot of people. And for some people it's just preference for aesthetic. Now at this point I've got tons of gardening space. I have all the space that I could want to grow things. But I still keep a handful of these green stalks as well as some different pots because I love having the different options. I also think that they have a really aesthetic appeal. I kind of look at gardening as an artistic expression, and so I am often considering the lines of things, patterns, heights, and I love the green stalks, for instance, because it just kind of mixes that up. They're interesting to look at, especially when they're full. I know right here this might not be as super impressing, but when these things are full of plants, it's really cool looking. Now also there can be benefits, especially in like a vertical growing situation, like when you're growing up in a container like this, or even just trellising out of a container, out of a bed, or out of the ground, is that you are bringing things up more to eye level where you don't have to bend over as much, which brings accessibility and again adds the aesthetic of different line and structure. I've got a whole argument for vertical gardening that It's obviously important to me. If you look around my garden, everything is going upward. But there is a little bit of a learning curve when it comes to container gardening. And as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of people have fails in gardening and they make it about them. The number of people that I hear that go, oh, I can't grow a thing, I kill everything, I have a black thumb, blah, 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 blah. And I just like shake my head. I'm like, listen, all our thumbs are different colors, and really all our thumbs could grow food if we wanted to. If you have failed at gardening, if you have failed in a container or in the ground, or you've killed houseplants, has nothing to do with your thumb. It really does usually come down to the attentiveness of the gardener and the conditions that the plants were given. Maybe you weren't unattentive, maybe you gave them too much love and you loved them straight to death. Plants need a handful of things to grow well. They need light, they need water, and they need nutrients. The big trick with growing in any container, whether you're growing in a vertical planter like the green stalk, or if you're growing in a pot or in a 5-gallon bucket, is that you have a contained amount of soil, which means you have a limited amount of nutrients. So when we're growing in the ground, there are things happening like groundwater moving through there. There's oftentimes a lot more critters in the soil and critters involved, whereas in a container, it is a little bit more isolated. So you just have to be mindful that you are feeding your plants. Most of the people that I have talked to that have had failures in containers, when I ask them, well, what's your fertilizing schedule look like? They kind of get this blank look on their face like, oh, I didn't realize that was needed. And it is. So when you buy soil, if you buy like a bag of potting soil, I think it's safe to say, and this is just kind of a roundabout, it's going to be different based on different soils, but if you buy the bag of soil, you put it in a container, you plant plants in it, you want to assume that you've got about 3 months of nutrition in that soil. Well, if you consider a gardening season, it's what, 6 months, 7 months, maybe even more than that. So a lot of times people will put plants in containers and then they start to grow really, really well. And then all of a sudden they start to get off-colored, or they're stunted, or they don't produce a lot of fruit. And people are like, what happened? I don't understand. This container must suck, or I must have a black thumb. No, your plant's hungry. Like, you got to feed it. Like, it's just, if you had a puppy and you put it out in the yard, you never gave it any food, you would not be surprised if it shriveled up and died. Plants, like all other living things, need nutrients, and they get that from their soil. The way I do that is I use worm casting tea. I do have resources showing how that's made. Will and I made a video and I did a blog post, I don't know, a couple years ago, kind of showing our process, creating worm compost tea. That's the majority of what I feed any of the plants. I will freshen up compost. So like this green stalk, when we plant them with fresh stuff each year, I don't completely empty the soil out. I'll put like an inch or two of fresh compost on top, which of course as it's watered, all of those nutrients are going to run down and incorporate throughout the soil. And if it's fresh soil, let's say I'm setting up a brand new container of green stalk, I won't necessarily start feeding it right away. However, like with this one that it's not fresh soil, this is refreshed soil, I'll probably start watering this with some worm casting tea or just like a good liquid fertilizer. I use Neptune's Harvest organic fish emulsion fertilizer, and I'll just put like a little capful, whatever the instructions say, in my water and pour it in the top. Whenever I water this, it has the mechanism that you water at the top and it runs through. When I'm watering other pots, I just pour a little bit of that fertilizer in a watering can and just water the pot. It's not fussy, it's not difficult. I set a reminder on my phone so that throughout the season I will water them with that fertilizer about every 2 weeks. A lot of times fertilizers will have the instruction on there. I don't worry about doing that as much with all of my in-ground stuff because they just have access to a lot more soil, therefore they already have access to more nutrients. But it's really, really important if you're in a container that you don't leave your plants in there to run out of food, because then you're not going to get any food out of them at all. So another big factor as far as the success of container gardening, sorry, the ducks and the geese's breakfast is on its way to them, so they're going to sing us the song of their people while I stand here and try to shoot a video. The other make and break factor is water. Now, mastering getting water right in any gardening situation takes just a little bit of expertise. And I would say that probably as many people kill or damage the plants in their containers by overwatering as they do by underwatering. I mean, we know when we're neglecting something and it's shriveling up because it's dry. Like, you can look at it and be like, oh man, I need to water that, but I'm running out to run errands, I gotta go to the store, I gotta do this, I got an appointment. And then, you know, a couple of days of blowing off a plant that you see is getting drier by the moment. You know, the grace period, it's small, you know, it'll shrivel up and it reaches a point that it can't come back. However, a lot of people overwater, so it's really important if you're growing in a container that it has good drainage. This is one of those things that if you don't have experience gardening, you can end up making a mistake simply from just not knowing any better. If you buy pots at the store that are meant for houseplants, they don't have holes in the bottom, which is great for houseplants, because when you set a plant on your piano and you water it, you definitely don't want water coming out from the bottom and getting all over your piano. However, those pots are not meant for outside use where, for instance, you're going to be catching rain, because plants can drown. Or if you have not enough drainage in your plant and you're watering it a bunch and it's catching a lot of the rain, essentially too much water, if it doesn't water bog your plants, if it doesn't drown them by making them sit in too much water, they'll just essentially rot. It will just wash all the nutrients out of your soil. So if you consider your soil to have so much organic matter in it and so much food for your plants as well as food for the microorganisms in your soil, and you just imagine just washing the heck out of it, just tons of water going through it, well, I mean, eventually the plant that's living in that, it can't access those nutrients because they're so watered down that your plant is going to get discolored. It's going to be more prone to disease because it's not nourished. Now, on the other end of that spectrum, if you have too much drainage in your container, so say you get a pot and you're like, oh, there's no holes, I'm going to put 27 holes in the bottom of it. Well, then the water is going to wash out too fast. So the water coming in that soil is ultimately how your plant is accessing the nutrition in the soil. I'm way oversimplifying this, but for the sake of beginners wrapping their head around it, you need to have the right balance. And when you water that container, the plant is able to absorb enough of that water that the soil itself is able to stay at the right setting of moisture so that the microorganisms in the soil can stay healthy. And I'll tell you that when you first get started, that can be a little bit overwhelming, because when you don't know something, you don't know it. And you can read all about it, but it's kind of hard to know for sure if you're doing it right. Now, what I do on any soil that I want to see if it needs water, especially in something like a container, because they are going to need to be watered a little more frequently than, say, your garden that's growing in the ground, is I just come in and I just stick my fingers in it just like this. And if I get to my first knuckle, so on my little hands, that's roughly about 1.5 inches. If I go in 1.5 inches here, if I'm not hitting like real moisture 1.5 inches deep, this needs water. Now the green stalk makes it easy because they have this like watering contraption on the top. You just water it in here and it flows down to all the different pockets. In any other container, what I typically want to do is I want to water it until I see water coming out the bottom. That's what I do on the green stalk too. I water it until I see water coming out the bottom. I live where it's really hot in the summer. I may have to water my containers every single day. That I don't water the rest of the garden every single day, but for a container, they're just going to dry out faster because the soil is being exposed to heat on all sides, whereas obviously in the ground, it's only getting that heat from the top. If the idea of getting moisture right is still overwhelming to you, let me reassure you of one thing: you're gonna get it. I mean, it doesn't take very long of gardening before you kill enough plants by looking at it while you run out to an errand and think, oh, that plant really needs some water, I'll do it later. And then you realize that it may have reached the point of no return. You learn from that, you grow from that. You may overwater something and then it gets mushy and gets diseased and died, and you learn, okay, maybe I loved that one a little too much, I was a little too attentive. But if you are in the early stages and you're feeling completely overwhelmed by this, they make moisture meters. I actually have them for my houseplants. I have this little tool that you stick in the soil and it rates whether the soil is too dry, too wet, or just right. And the reason I got it for my houseplants was because a lot of times my kids help me water my houseplants, and I needed something for them to be able to look at, because I explained the whole finger in the soil thing to them, but they were still unsure, and the moisture meter just takes the guesswork out of that, you can totally use one of those in your containers or out in your garden. And they're inexpensive. I'll find one and put a link to it if I can find the exact one that I have. I've had it for a long time, and I think I paid something like between $10 and $15 for it. They're a fairly inexpensive tool if you need something to give you the confidence that you're getting it right. All right, doesn't look like much now. I still have quite a few open spaces, but I put that whole tray of sweet peas in. I'm probably going to try putting a couple other kinds of flowers in here, but I really wanted a lot of fragrance right here in the door. Plants need light, as I mentioned. What is considered full sun is like 6 hours a day of sunlight. If you have your container in a fully shaded place, those plants are not going to thrive. 4 to 6 hours a day is pretty non-negotiable when it comes to growing any sort of food crops. There are plants you can grow in the shade, but most food plants need full sun. People assume full sun means it needs to be like in the blaring sun morning to evening, and that's really not the case. That can actually be just as detrimental as not enough sun, because plants will just bake if they're in too much sun. Usually what I like to do with any sort of containers is make sure that they are getting uninterrupted sunlight for 6 hours a day, but that there is some sort of shade being cast on them, usually for the hottest part of the afternoon. Morning sun is ideal, and then once you get into like 2 in the afternoon, if your containers can be in a place where they're getting shade. Like in the case of these green stalks, they're in the high tunnel, it has the shade cloth over them. Like a lot of my containers are like out where they're next to the pavilion, so in the morning they're getting the light, in the afternoon the pavilion is blocking the light. If you have no option and your containers are just out in the sun morning to night, you're going to have to be a little more mindful on watering. And again, making sure that you're watering deeply every day. I mentioned the water meter, sticking your finger in. With containers, just because you spray it with a hose and it looks watered does not mean that that water actually got down deep into the soil. So make sure you're getting past that surface level when you're checking on it. Now, this last thing goes back to moisture. I'm doing this off the cuff. I should have made notes, I'm sorry. But the last thing is that if you have a container of soil, no matter what it is, whether it's something like a green stalk, a pot, a bucket, even in a raised bed, this can apply. Let's say it was winter. You stuck your container off to the side, you didn't touch it, maybe it was blocked from getting rained on, and that soil got really, really, really dry over the winter. Spring comes along, you're excited, you're like, I'm gonna put some plants in here, I'm gonna grow some seeds in here, and everything fails. And you're like, what happened? I'm watering it rightly, but it just, maybe you notice it's drying out super fast. Something can happen called hydrophobia, which is basically when soil becomes so dry that a lot of that microbiome in the soil gets damaged. And essentially the soil can become so brittle and dead. Soil isn't really living or dead, it's whether it's healthy because there are things living in it. But if all the things living in the soil are dying, your soil can become so brittle that it cannot break the surface of water. Like the structure's not strong enough. I'm pretty sure I just swallowed a bug. And if it can't break the surface of water, it means you can be watering your soil, but your soil staying super dry because essentially it's repelling water. And the solution to hydrophobia, and it's important if you're a container gardener, especially at the beginning of the season, because a lot of people neglect watering their soil over the winter. If it's out where it can get rain, it probably doesn't matter because most places get more rain over the winter. But if for some reason you had a container that was covered over winter, you need to add more organic matter to that soil. So if you let something like a green stalk or a pot get super dry over the winter, you don't necessarily have to toss that soil, but just putting a layer of compost on top may not be enough. You may actually, what I have done in the past, lay a tarp out, dump the soil that you have, the hydrophobic soil, out of the container, get some fresh compost and mix it throughout, put it back in, and then put like a single squirt. You don't want to do too much because it is antimicrobial, so it can be damaging if you do too much, but put a single squirt of dish soap in water. Dish soap makes, the way they say it, it makes water wetter. It essentially breaks the surface of the water structure so that the soil can come in contact with it rather than repelling it. When you get into like Dawn and stuff like that, it's antimicrobial, so it can actually damage what life you have. But in the case of like severely hydrophobic soil, it's kind of like, well, get it wet and then you can build the life back up. Water it with that, mix it all in, and then put it back in your container, and then make sure you stay on top of watering it. Because essentially, when you have good compost that's healthy, that has lots of life in it, and you put it right next to the hydrophobic soil, what happens is this good soil can hold water. And so it can slowly, by being right next to the hydrophobic soil, it can kind of slowly allow that water to make its way into the hydrophobic soil. So mixing those together, watering it with something that helps break that surface of the water, you can bring hydrophobic soil back. Now, if you just want to spend your money and you don't care, obviously you could throw that hydrophobic soil out into the lawn or into a garden bed. It will eventually rehydrate if it's getting enough water eventually. But the fastest way is to start over, but it's not necessary. I mean, soil is expensive, and if you've already filled up a big container once and then you have something like this happen, the idea of having to go buy all new soil is a big expense that's really not fully necessary. Next time I'm with my mom, I need to get her to give you guys some input on container gardening, because my mom is the best container gardener I know. And for her, it's a matter of accessibility, ease. The sunniest parts of her yard were not places where she could put a garden in, so she did lots and lots of pots. And now she grows a ton of food in her backyard entirely in containers. I've done some videos with my mom in the past kind of showing her container garden. She's funny when you talk to her about it though, because she's just been doing it for so long that to her so many things seem like common sense. And I remember for the longest time listening to her, and she's saying things that are like blowing my mind that I have no clue what she's talking about, but she's talking about them as if they're complete common sense. So I would be like, huh, like, what am I missing here? I know, she's a great gardener, and I've learned a lot of things from her. Well, that was one of my tasks for today. I have quite a few to get to, but right now I'm gonna go eat some lunch. Thank you guys for hanging out with me today. Let me know, what do you love growing in containers? Why do you love growing in containers? And again, I'll put a link down below so you guys can check out the leaf sale over at Greenstock, because they are some of my favorite containers to grow in. Thanks for hanging out with me today. God bless you. Until next time.